Welcome to the Pacific Research Institute's Next Round podcast. I'm Marina Ichon, COO, and with me as always is Tim Anaya, Vice President of Marketing and Communications. How are you, Tim?
I am great. How are you?
Fine, thanks. So, Tim, did you watch the Super Bowl and who are you rooting for?
I did watch the Super Bowl. I guess I was nominally rooting for Kansas City since the Eagles beat my beloved 49ers. But I think, Patrick Mahomes is quite a good person. And I think someone that, you can all root for to succeed. So I'm glad it turned out to be a very exciting game in the second half, at least.
Now, did you have a party with the guys?
I didn't have any party, but I did make chili. So I viewed that was sort of exciting. But I think the 49ers losing took it kind of the air out of the sails for people around here throwing parties.
Well, I didn't watch the game because I was doing some work for a charity I work with. But my mother, who is 92, she's very competitive and loves to watch all these big sports matches. So she was rooting for Kansas City because she always likes the underdog. And what do you know? They won in the final minutes.
And I think the national anthem by Chris Stapleton was probably the highlight of the game. I would say, if you haven't listened, go check it out on YouTube. I would argue it's probably a top 5 all-time Super Bowl national anthem. It's not Whitney, no one's ever going to beat Whitney, but I would say it's probably a top 5 best performances all time. Even the coach for Philadelphia was tearing up during the national anthem. It was so moving. The halftime, I would say, was good. I like Rihanna. She kind of sang all her hits. It wasn't, I would say it wasn't the most exciting halftime show, but it was fine, but just kind of a ordinary halftime show.
Well, as we know, Tim, guess who was missing? President Biden and the Super Bowl interview.
Very interesting. And I don't know if you were following the backstory of this whole thing, but traditionally, the president does a sit-down interview with the network anchor person of the network that's broadcasting the Super Bowl. So, of course, this year the Super Bowl was on Fox, and the Biden administration really kind of stalled a long time over whether they would be doing an interview with Fox or not. And then it was announced they would be doing an interview with something called Fox Soul, which apparently is an online network that's aimed at African Americans. And they were going to have the actress Vivica A. Fox be the person asking President Biden questions. Well, that's not exactly a serious sit down, right? To have an actress who is a noted Biden supporter asking you the questions. So Fox corporate canceled the interview. And there was a lot of back and forth. Are we going to do it? We're going to do it. We're not going to do it. But it didn't end up happening. But I don't know about you, but in hindsight, what a missed opportunity. This is the biggest audience of the year. It's by far the number one television broadcast of the year is the Super Bowl. What a missed opportunity to communicate directly with the people. A lot more people watch the Super Bowl than the State of the Union, that's for sure.
Tim, I have the opposite reaction. I actually think that the White House played this right, because if I were director of communications, given everything that's transpired, especially the president's poor interview skills, poor communication skills, I would have hemmed and hawed and put an end to it. Who would have done the interview? It would have been Bret Baier. He's going to have tough questions. Look, you've got the balloon, you've got all kinds of things going here, and could have been a catastrophic interview, and we'd be talking about it for days. If the president does run for president again, this could be great campaign fodder. The White House Communications Office that is, in my opinion, making mistakes all the time. I think they did the right thing this time. It's a one-day inside baseball story versus a catastrophic interview that would have gone on for days.
What's interesting, though, is that, in comparison, if you look back in history, Barack Obama did the interview when Fox broadcasted the Super Bowl. Bill O'Reilly, of all people, interviewed him. But yet, Barack Obama's communication skills were far superior than compared to Joe Biden.
Yeah, and that said, I actually think that Bret Baier would have been very gracious to him, or Sean Hannity. They would have asked some tough questions, but they would have been kind and gracious because they would want a next interview, right? So they would have done everything they can to try to make him feel comfortable. But I still think they would have asked some tough questions. Speaking of poor communications, how about those flying objects in the sky, Tim?
Well, I'm just baffled by the communications over it. I get it in some aspect because you don't want to create panic. Obviously something is up there and we don't know a lot. We clearly don't know a lot about what it is, how it is being powered, what communication capabilities do these devices have? What threat does it pose, if any, when we shoot them down? So, and are these four the only ones? Are there more flying right now that we have no idea? The real questions about our ability to detect these kinds of devices. Now, the Pentagon has gone out there and done some press events on these things, but really noticeably absent has been the president. And I get it. You can't say much and you need to convey strength, especially when an adversary is testing you. But boy, I think, if a picture speaks 1,000 words, I think silence speaks 10,000 words. This is a time where the president has to be engaged with the American people and engage publicly on the international stage, even if you're just projecting American strength. And it certainly does not give me second thoughts if I'm China, if this is how the president's responding.
Well, starting with the big spy balloon. Well, frankly, I wasn't that worried because I was pretty confident that eventually we would get around to doing the right thing and blow it out of the sky. Of course, that would cost us. Our slowness would cost us. But I thought that we would do the right thing and reduce the damage. Well, now there have been a total of 4 objects since this morning, and it's becoming a little weird. And the only ones that could really give us even some clarification would be the White House. And we're getting nothing. Tim, I've got to believe that this is the worst communications team in modern history. If I were Dr. Jill Biden, I'd suggest to my husband, he's got a clean house. Frankly, it starts with the top. It starts with the president. He's a poor communicator, which is all the more reason why I would get the AAA team. I would try to compensate for myself if I were a poor communicator and get the best possible team out there. And with, Karine Jean-Pierre, she doesn't really have the disposition to be a press secretary, don't you think? She's awkward. She gets rattled. She seems really uncomfortable up there in the podium. And the White House, the staff leaves her twisting in the wind. And you're a press secretary. As you know, I've been a Wall Street spokesperson. You got to be tough. You can't show any fear, even though you're quaking inside. You got to be quick and sassy and still dripping with charm. And she's very awkward. I feel kind of sorry for her. And they're all kind of hiding in the trenches, not speaking to the public. And that just means that all of our imaginations go wild.
That's exactly right. Well, if you as the president or whoever the principal is a poor communicator, well, you really need an all-star team for your communications surrogates. And, Karine Jean-Pierre just doesn't have it. I think, if I were them, I would beg somebody like Rachel Maddow to come be the White House press secretary, or somebody who's a really top-notch, nationally recognized communicator for the liberal side of things, because you need an effective communicator, but you need a persuasive, strong advocate on your behalf as your public face. And, it just makes their job that much harder as administration when you cannot effectively communicate.
That said, let's move on to our podcast. Our guest this week is Steve Smith, who is our senior fellow in urban studies. In other words, he's our crime fellow. So Steve was a former police officer. He helped organize peacekeeping forces abroad, and he's a former professor of justice administration. And he's come out with a new study, a very timely one, on how many of California's soft on crime laws have really made our streets less safe.
It's something that you won't read anywhere else. The kind of politicians and academics have been quick to embrace these laws like AB 109 and Prop 47 and Prop 57 as effectively lowering crime rates in California. But it's become more groupthink than an actual honest look at the numbers. And I would argue this is the first piece that has come back where someone's actually pushing back on that common narrative to show that we are seeing significantly more victimization in California after these measures have been enacted than before. So I think it's even though, there's a lot of data, a lot of numbers in this study, but it's presented in a very readable way. And I think you'll be very interested to hear what Steve has to say, especially as we talked in light of a tragic shooting of a police officer in Selma, California, which is in the greater Fresno area in the Central Valley. And the offender allegedly was someone who was out because of all of these policy mistakes. So if you're concerned at all about crime in California, I think you'll be interested to hear what Steve has to say.
Thanks, everyone, for listening. And here's Steve Smith. Steve, we're so happy to have you on to talk about your compelling new study, Paradise Lost: Crime in California Between 2011 and 2021. So our interested listeners can download a copy at pacificresearch.org. Your paper tells the story of a dramatic shift in public safety policy in that decade and dire consequences for Californians as a result. In the opening of your paper, you write that in 2011, before sweeping policy changes were made, California was actually the safest it had been in 30 years. What were we doing right back then? Tell us about some of the policies from that era that made a real difference in lowering crime rates.
Well, thanks, Rowena. As our members will read, in 1994, homicides in California reached a high of 4,096 victims. Shortly after, through legislative action and ballot initiative, California passed the Three Strikes Law, which had an immediate effect on the homicide rate. By 2011, it had dropped to its 21st century low. Other legislation and ballot initiatives reduced crime, like Prop 21, which enabled prosecutors to charge juveniles as adults, gang and firearm sentencing enhancements. Sex offenders faced cumulative sentencing, which meant repeat rapists and child molesters were both sentenced and served for each count, one count at a time. So, if you finished serving your sentence for the first crime you committed, then you began serving the sentence for the second one, which is appropriate. If you commit 10 rapes, you should not have those 10 crimes served concurrently as if you only did one. And what's often not discussed is the remarkable deterrent effect that Three Strikes had. During the Three Strikes political debate, the Department of Corrections estimated that the prison population would balloon to nearly 250,000 inmates. That was based on projections and rate of incarceration for the decade preceding 1994, when Three Strikes was passed and was wrong.
So, as you write in your study, California underwent a massive policy shift starting in 2011, seemingly because of the state's budget problems and also a big prison overcrowding problem. So, set the stage for us. How big were these problems back then, and why were lawmakers prompted to act?
Well, back in the years 2008 to 2012, California faced multi-billion-dollar budget shortfalls that required state worker furloughs, IOUs instead of paycheck, rollbacks in services, closing of government offices up to, I think, 3 days a month at the height. At the same time, California had been engaged in a multi-year lawsuit with the federal government over our burgeoning prison population. To satisfy the terms of what became known as the Plata decision and to reduce spending, California devised AB 109, known as realignment. Under realignment, nonviolent, non-sex offender, and non-serious inmates would be transferred to the custody of the county jails from which they were sentenced, and future sentences for what became known as the triple nons would be served in county jails. Others would be released based on their sentence completion dates and then placed on parole, but it was parole on paper only. Triple nons were placed on what we called non-revocable parole, or NRP, which meant you were only paroled, like I said, on paper. There was no violation that could revoke you other than committing a fresh criminal offense. So really, it was a free pass, and one that was expanded upon by future legislation, as the report says.
So, Steve, you document that in response to these problems, plus the state's ineffective rehabilitation programs, the state enacted AB 109, followed by the voter-approved Props 47 and 57 and other measures. So for our listeners who may not be familiar with their specific provisions, what policy changes were ushered in by these measures, and how big a shift did they represent in the policies they replaced?
Right. Well, I call it the decade of enabling and the end of deterrence. Most people at this point know that Prop 47 raised the felony threshold for theft from $400 to $950. But it also effectively decriminalized personal use possession of most drugs. Even for 2 years, it made the theft of any firearms valued less than $950 a misdemeanor, although that was corrected by the legislature 2 years later. Also under Prop 57, thefts from locked vehicles are no longer potential felonies. Repeated petty theft convictions cannot be charged as felonies, contrary to what the governor has said. Entry into commercial businesses to steal from them is no longer a felony. Loitering for the purposes of prostitution is no longer a crime. So thieves, drug addicts, and even human traffickers have enabled by a drop in sanctions for what were admittedly less serious crimes, but they were crimes that often enabled law enforcement to prevent more serious crimes and to signal to would-be offenders a lack of consequences. In terms of Prop 57, I can't state this any more plainly. Prop 57 has shortened the prison sentence of virtually every classification of prisoner inmate, with the exception of LWOPs, or people serving life without the possibility of parole, and people under sentence of death. Many murderers who pleaded guilty to 25 to life sentences are actually now eligible for parole. In addition, SB 1391 enabled the criminal exploitation of minors by making it impossible to charge anyone under the age of 16 as an adult and difficult to charge 16 and 17-year-olds as an adult. 75% of juvenile murders will be out of custody before they are 25 years old. But the more hidden consequence is that by giving juveniles a form of immunity for serious crimes, you have made them perfect victims of criminal street gangs who can exploit them without consequence to the juvenile. On top of that, we have AB 3234, which changed the definition of elderly parole to include anyone in the prison system that was 50 and over if they had served just 20 years of their sentence. And while I do think some elderly inmates have aged out of their criminal behaviors, I don't know of anyone who thinks age 50 is that threshold.
So in your paper, you argue that these policy changes usher in what you call an era of mass victimization, with more Californians becoming crime victims in a host of categories. In some categories like homicides and aggravated assaults and drug overdose deaths, you saw the numbers rise significantly. So walk us through these numbers. Just how bad have things gotten?
Yeah, I call it that mass victimization because reported and unreported victimization far exceeds the incarceration statistics of not just the state prison system, which the study is focused on, but also our county jails. From 2011 to 2021, homicides are up 31.6%. Aggravated assaults are up 34.6%. Drug overdose deaths are up a shocking 715% over their deaths in 2000. Use 2000 because that is the year when voters were convinced to pass Prop 36, which allowed for drug diversion, which meant no incarceration for people arrested for drug possession in what are known as personal use quantities. Reported rapes are up from under 8,000 in 2011 to over 14,000 in 2021.
At the same time, Steve, some categories of crime, such as burglaries and larcenies, actually went down during this period. So what's behind the decline in these numbers compared with rising incidents of crime and victimization in so many of the other categories?
Yeah, well, a lot of it is, I think, that crime victims are giving up on using the formal criminal justice system to get help. So despite those official statistics of a trending down, it's clear that thefts and burglaries are actually up. And on a year-to-year basis, property crimes actually did go up in 21 over 2020. Retail trade groups are reporting higher theft numbers, and prices are a reflection of this. It's not just inflation that drives higher prices, it's also theft and the cost of security that retail businesses have to implement in order to stay in business. Higher prices hurt the poor and middle class the most. A Stanford study, along with the San Francisco Chronicle, conducted a poll that showed that 45% of San Franciscans had been the victims of a crime. That's nearly 400,000 people. Yet just 790 people were held in the San Francisco County Jail by December of 2022.
So when you hear academics and some politicians talk about AB 109 and Prop 47 and Prop 57, they're always quick to right off the bat dismiss any assertion that these measures are responsible for rising crime rate. In fact, some actually argue that crime has gone down due to the measures. So walk us through their thinking and why, in your view, they're incorrect.
Well, They're saying that because they're able to reach farther and farther back in history to find crime rates that they can get underneath to justify the changes. In the recently published 2021 crime statistics, Attorney General Rob Bonta admits that some crimes are creeping up, but still below, quote, their historical high point in 1980. It takes a pretty experienced spin doctor to reach back 50 years to convince people they are better off. And frankly, most of that reduction was due to three strikes, not the current policy of decarceration and decriminalization. And, a lot of it is simply because crime has been redefined. There are fewer petty thefts because petty thefts have been redefined. There are fewer burglaries because burglaries have been redefined. It used to be if you entered into a business with the intent to commit theft, you had committed the crime of burglary. And that is no longer the case. So it doesn't surprise me that burglaries are down. And it doesn't surprise me that people who are being victimized over and over and over again have learned not to bother calling the police because they know nothing will be done. Hence, crimes appear to be down. But the big indicators, homicide, aggravated assault, and sexual assault are all up and all up conclusively. And yes, there was a spike in 2021, but that spike was on top of an increasing trend that was already occurring. So I don't think it's really possible for for advocates of the current administration's policies to continue to blame COVID for the increase in crime. In addition, COVID ended, yet crime is still increasing. It might not be increasing as quickly as it was during COVID, but it is still increasing.
So recently we saw the tragic murder of a Selma police officer, which turned into a political battle between the Fresno County DA, who said politicians who supported measures like AB 109 have blood on their hands in this case, and Governor Newsom, who said he was tired of being lectured by the DA. So who's right here? Walk us through the facts of the case and explain how the past decade of policy changes are to blame here. And how have Governor Newsom's executive orders of recent years contributed to the problem?
Well, tragically, Officer Carrasco's death in Selma was both predictable and preventable. It's the perfect example of a failed system and another example of what has been occurring really over the past year. Smiley Martin shot 19 people on the streets in Sacramento just last year. Ariel Maynor shot his victim in her bed just last year, and both were the recipients of Prop 57 early releases. In the case of Officer Carrasco's murderer, in 2019, he had been arrested for trespassing, narcotics charges, a felon in possession of a dirk or dagger, which is a form of illegal knife, second-degree robbery, and auto theft, for which he received a sentence on July 21st of 2020 of 3 years probation. By August of 2020, just the next month, he was rearrested on two separate occasions for additional gun and drug charges. About a year and a half later, in March of 2022, he pleaded no contest to possession of a controlled substance while armed with a firearm and possession of a firearm by a felon, for which he was sentenced to 5 years and 4 months in the state prison. On September 22nd, just 6 months into his sentence, he was released by the governor to a term of 3 years of community supervision. And I should correct that just a little bit. The governor didn't release him. The governor's policies released him. Barely a month later, he was rearrested for failure to meet with his probation officer. And 3 weeks later, on November 15th, he was again set free on probation. This is because under Prop 57, violent offenders no longer serve 85% of their sentence, and actually nonviolent offenders no longer serve even 50% of their sentence, which is what Prop 57 said. They are given credit for time served in county jail, regardless of whether that time is good time, and they are eligible for early release credits for just expressing a willingness to participate in rehabilitation programs if one isn't available. Now they are returned to the counties under community release. He was rearrested, then returned to community release, and it would just take him 10 more weeks to obtain another firearm and allegedly shoot and kill Officer Carrasco, when in effect he should have been in prison for 14 more months. Probation departments work for the judges. If the suspect wasn't sent to prison in 2019, it was probably consistent with what probation departments are recommending and judges are imposing. His violations and return to probation are a perfect example of that. At this point, prosecutors have to contend, in many cases, with a hostile judiciary that is made up of appointees who are politically aligned with the governor's policies, the majority of whom have been appointed and elected since 2011.
So since the George Floyd killing during the COVID-19 pandemic, there's been a lot of focus by policies on racial disparities in the criminal justice decision and the criminal justice system. So you've seen many lawmakers justify these type of sweeping policy changes you explore in your book as a way to correct systemic injustices in the system. Yet you argue that African Americans are actually becoming crime victims at higher numbers because these policies have been put in place. So tell us what you found in your research, and in your view, what's the best way policymakers can address racial disparities in our criminal justice system?
Absolutely. The biggest racial disparity here is the racial disparity in victimization. A victim-oriented approach to criminal justice shows that Black Americans are victimized by violent crime far higher rates than whites or Hispanic. We also know that most crime stays within racial and ethnic groups. So it goes to reason that Blacks will be arrested at that same disproportionate rate. I support crime prevention programs that enhance what we call protective factors. Factors like higher educational aspirations, better access to quality educational programs, involvement in after-school programs, involvement in faith, participation in athletics, scouting, better access to tutoring, better internet connectivity, and protection from victimization by gangs and others who exploit and victimize children.
So as we close, let's talk about what can be done to correct some of these policy mistakes. We have a liberal supermajority in the legislature, and many legislators still embrace the policy shifts that you explore in your study. Given this, what legislation should reform-minded lawmakers be considering this session to curb some of the worst excesses of the last decade of policy mistakes and could actually win approval in this challenging political environment?
It's three things. We need better deterrence. We need real incapacitation of violent offenders. And we do need better quality rehabilitation programs and require people to participate in them. It's no longer good enough that they just be willing to participate in rehabilitation. They need to do it. They need to internalize it. And they need to, what we say, walk the walk. As the years from 1994 to 2011 showed, deterrence slowed the rate of incarceration from a 190% increase in the decade preceding three strikes to an increase of just 31% after three strikes. This tells me that the deterrence works. In addition, violent offenders who have not been rehabilitated should not be released, period. Governor Brown made that case when he spoke before the Little Hoover Commission in 2003. Like he said then, and I agree with him now, we should return to indeterminate sentences for violent offenders with minimum terms and clearly defined benchmark that inmates must achieve before they can be eligible for release. And lastly, we need to support families and children. Wes Moore, the newly elected governor of Maryland, is a perfect example. As a teenager growing up in Baltimore, his parents saw that he was being involved in criminal activity and failing in the public school system. They moved quickly to enroll him in a military school, separating him from the influences of older criminals in Baltimore and the stigma that he was a bad kid. Moore went on to graduate from Johns Hopkins University and then became a Rhodes Scholar at Oxford. He became an investment banker, served his country in the Army, has written several books, and like I just said, was recently elected governor of Maryland. Moore's family had the advantage of the resources to send him to a school of their choice and look at the results. Shouldn't every family have the same choice?
Thanks so much, Steve. This is a very sobering subject, and we hope our listeners will take a look at Steve's study. We don't think there's anything quite like it out there. It's practical, it's readable. There's a lot of data, but I think Steve puts it in such a way that it's not a slog to read, and I hope that listeners would take a look at it. It's at pacificresearch.org. Thanks so much, everyone, for listening. If you like this episode, please tell your friends and subscribe to PRI's podcast at iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, TuneIn, iHeartRadio, and Spotify. And when you're on these platforms, don't forget to give us a big 5 stars. If you don't subscribe to any of these, you can still listen on PRI's YouTube page, youtube.com/Pacific Research 1. That's the number 1. Thanks for listening. I'm Rowena Itchon. Hope you'll come back again for next round with PRI.